I have finished the second to the last on my poison book list, the Arsenic Century. And this one is a little bit different in that it does not focus on people deliberately poisoning people so much as some of the other ones did. This one focuses on arsenic and how it kind of became a chemical of all trades in England. This book is English, so it's more focusing on that. It became a chemical of all trades, and because of that, it was incredibly easy to be poisoned by it because it was in so much stuff. Now, that being said, I am amending my opinion of Mary Cotton yet again because just based off of how arsenic works and kind of seeing how people may have been exposed to it one way or the other, I do think she was killing family members. And he also brings up that it was kind of a thing at that time because of the way you could kind of buy into burial plans, and it was kind of an insurance for a decent burial. And if people weren't that attached to certain family members, that was not unheard of, that people would be it was kind of a joke around certain areas too, that if a family had too many kids or whatever else, some people weren't real motherly, times were hard. It was just one of those things that you may see children being done away with so that they could get some of this. It was kind of an insurance. It wasn't an insurance, but it was, you could pay forward and you could get money for a funeral. And if you didn't spend all that money for a funeral, you got to keep it. And that's still kind of the way it is today, even when you have burial plans. But he goes into that. He starts at that at the beginning and kind of how arsenic became such a prevalent thing in chemical usage at that time. And then he goes into what the arsenic was being used in. And it was being used in everything. Doctors were using it in medicines to some degree, even though they knew it was poisonous and there was arguing against it. You had it being used in dyes. I knew about Scheele's Green, but there was apparently a bunch of dyes that this was being used in, and a good number had arsenic in it to produce a bright color. You had it being used in all sorts of farming stuff and poisoning poor sheep herders right and left because they used it as a sheep dip. And if you used too much, you could poison everything. If you didn't put stuff on your hands, you could very easily end up getting poisoned yourself because of the way arsenic works. There's a lot of explanation about how arsenic does work and how it sort of leaches through stuff, and you can have arsenic going through your body even after you're dead. And that became part of a case at one point. You have arsenic being used in beer because it was being used for something. It was being used to bleach the hops and different. It just was in everything. It was in food products. It was in paper. They were using it to dye stuff that was on candies and different things. And lots of people, just a laundry list of people getting poisoned by arsenic in every way imaginable. Now, some of them, I do say some people were just being negligent, because there's a whole part where he talks about people were accidentally getting killed by arsenic because they were not marking their containers of it very well and putting it the same place that there were sugar and flour. So it was very, very easy to get it mixed up with. But there were people being poisoned that had no clue that they were even being poisoned because of the roundabout way of contamination that was happening and people adulterating the food products at the time to make extra money. Now, I'm going to mention this one part because this is a very roundabout way that this guy ended up getting poisoned. And this is just sort of par for the course, but it's hard to explain unless I actually read it. Dangerous food and drink could come to market through far more complicated mechanisms, through serial adulterations in which no one anticipated that physical injury might result. Ackham, who was one of these scientists here, traced the Libertine route, for example, by which a London man was made ill by the Gloucester cheese he often took with dinner. After several episodes of poisoning, the man had the cheese tested chemically and learned it contained red lead. But when he complained to his cheesemonger, the merchant assured him he had added nothing to the product. Undeterred, the man sought out the farmer from whom the monger had purchased the cheese and wrung from him an admission that he'd mixed annatto with the cheese, but nothing more. Annatto was a yellow-red dye made from the seeds of a tropical tree and was commonly used to give cheese a more intense color. Okay, so there's nothing wrong there at this stage. Further investigation determined that the man who sold the annatto to the farmer had been dissatisfied with the color of that particular batch, so had added vermilion, a red pigment, with it. Vermilion is a compound of mercury and not particularly wholesome substance to consume in quantity, but it is not red lead. Going yet one more step, the London gentleman learned from the druggist from whom the annatto merchant had purchased the vermilion that he commonly added the inexpensive red lead to his vermilion to increase his profit, and did not worry about poisoning anyone because he assumed the vermilion would be used only in house paint. What Ackham called the circuitous operations of commerce worked in wondrous and poisonous ways indeed. So you could have no intention of poisoning somebody, but they were adulterating food with things that they didn't know where it necessarily came from, that was adulterated by other things, that when you got back to the beginning, there was lead in this case, not arsenic, but the same idea. So you're having this sort of situation happening constantly around this time, to the point that it was hard to tell whether people were being poisoned by different things, whether you died of a certain thing, how much you were being poisoned by something, because people react differently to arsenic depending on dosage amount, depending on the person. Even the arsenic affects things differently. So the arsenic situation, this was wild, and I do see how poisonings at this time did end up happening deliberately very easily, and he kind of talks about that at the beginning. But more than anything is the fact that if it was deliberate, there was a certain way the deliberate happened. The products poisoning people tended to be a little slower and a little differently done. So that's why I said I'm amending my analysis again when I said about Mary Cotton. I thought, well, she might have killed some, but not all of them. I'm kind of thinking she probably killed the greater bulk of them at this point, because this was one of these things that you just couldn't. It's the slow poisoning from, say, Wallpaper or whatever else is not necessarily going to look the same way as when somebody just dumps a whole thing of arsenic in your tea. Now, again, that being said, he talks about Napoleon, which was always the question about whether Napoleon was killed by his wallpaper or not. He said, no, that's pretty much not that whole thing. He didn't really have any much more arsenic than Josephine had in her hair, and some of his other relatives had in their hair at that time. So that was not an odd thing. It was more than likely probably medicine he was using that got in his system that would cause that arsenic in his hair. He talked about poison eaters, the fact that there was a big, and I had heard about this case, the Maybrick case, where the wife was accused of poisoning the husband, and she said, well, he was a hypochondriac who took arsenic all the time anyway, so the arsenic you're finding in him is probably going to be the arsenic that he gave himself. And that was a thing, because there was a whole group that they swore by the fact that arsenic was one of those things that made you healthier, even when shown evidence to the contrary eventually. They had all these different ideas about arsenic and how that sort of operated, and it made your complexion better. That was in cosmetics and different stuff like that. There were arsenic eaters who just sort of used that as something that they thought was going to cause virility and longevity and health and all sorts of stuff like that. Same way we have people who believe in quack stuff now and think certain crazy things are going to make them healthier or whatever else. So while this does seem like a thick book, I actually read this very, very quickly because it was really interesting, and Wharton is very, very readable. This is one of the better chemistry-ish type books where somebody's talking about a chemical that I've ever read. Generally, the science part of stuff gets a little bogged down, and I don't care about that as much. But in this case, that was actually very, very readable. And he moved on. He has so many copious stories about arsenic being used and the end results of all of that it really is interesting. And he does bring up the Borgias in here again and talks about some of the other famous sort of poisoners, because he talks about Catherine de' Medici as well, who my last book on the poison list is a biography of Catherine, because she was claimed to be a great poisoner, which that remains to be seen in that biography. So I am done almost with my list of poison books. We're down to almost one. I'm learning far more about poison than I ever expected to learn about, and people who may or may not have poisoned people. I also am probably going to do a segue because I'm reading some lesser known horror novels that I'm kind of going to take a look at, that I had found a list of some that another YouTuber had suggested. And the one I'm kind of in the middle of right now is The Case Against Satan, which I will have a review of soon, because it's not a very long book and I'm almost done with it. And it is an interesting little grandfather of The Exorcist. There's so many similarities that I don't see how Blatty did not read this book previously. But anyway, so there's several things in the works at this point, but I cannot recommend enough this book about arsenic and how the Victorians barely made it out of the Victorian age without poisoning themselves away.